Why future humans studied 2025 like a psychological collapse. By the late 2080s, behavioral historians stopped referring to the early internet era as the information age. The classification changed after decades of neurological analysis. Future archives eventually described the years between 2010 and 2030 differently, not as a technological revolution, but as a period when human attention began fragmenting faster than human psychology could adapt. At first, researchers believed the damage was temporary, a side effect of rapid connectivity, an adjustment period. But the deeper the archive studies became, the stranger conclusions started to look, because the evidence suggested something uncomfortable. Human beings were not overwhelmed by information itself. They were transformed by continuous exposure to incomplete emotional experiences, thousands of emotional fragments every day, headlines without resolution, arguments without consequence, tragedies interrupted by advertisements, intimacy compressed into notifications, grief measured in engagement metrics, and eventually, a civilization unable to remain psychologically present for longer than a few seconds at a time. Future anthropologists later called this period the scroll era, not because people used screens, but because scrolling slowly became the dominant structure of human thought. Archive records from 2094 contain reconstructed behavioral simulations from ordinary households in 2025. The footage is almost difficult to watch now, not because it looks primitive, because it looks familiar. A man wakes up before speaking to another human being, before drinking water, before fully opening his eyes. His thumb is already moving across a glass surface. News, conflict, entertainment, fear, desire, outrage, humor, death, advertising. 30 emotional states in less than 4 minutes. The archive notes describe this as continuous cognitive destabilization through emotional velocity saturation. But outside research facilities, people use simple language. They called it normal life. One behavioral study conducted in 2071 attempted to measure how often citizens from the early 2020s experienced uninterrupted thought. The answer shocked researchers. Most subjects could not remain alone with their thoughts for more than a few minutes without reaching for stimulation, not because they lacked discipline, because silence itself had started feeling psychologically incomplete. Current models suggest this may have been one of the earliest signs of large-scale attention fragmentation. The human nervous system evolved in environments where emotional experiences arrived slowly. A single event could define an entire day, sometimes an entire year. But digital civilization changed the scale completely. Now emotional states arrived faster than the brain could metabolize them. Before grief finished processing, another notification arrived. Before curiosity matured into understanding, another headline interrupted it. Before reflection formed, the next stimulus appeared. And eventually, many people stopped noticing the interruption itself. One preserved archive entry from 2025 contains a sentence repeated by millions of individuals across multiple platforms. "I think my attention span is getting worse." At the time, the statement was usually framed as a joke. But future neurological analysis suggests it may have been one of the largest unrecognized behavioral shifts in modern history, because attention was never just attention. It was emotional continuity, identity stability, memory formation, human presence. When attention fragments continuously, the self begins fragmenting with it. Researchers studying long-term cognitive patterns discovered something even more unsettling. The average individual from the scroll era consumed more emotional information in a single day than earlier civilizations processed in months. But almost none of it settled into long-term psychological meaning. People were exposed to everything, but internally connected to almost nothing. This created a condition later referred to as reality compression, a psychological state where all events begin feeling emotionally equal due to constant exposure density. War footage beside cooking tutorials, economic collapse beside comedy clips, humans suffering beside product advertisements. Everything flattened into identical scrolling motion. The archive repeatedly describes this period using one unusual phrase: emotion without absorption. One of the most disturbing discoveries came from reconstructed social interaction studies. By the late 2020s, many individuals were no longer experiencing boredom naturally. And at first, that sounded like progress. Why tolerate boredom when infinite stimulation existed? But historians later realized boredom had served an important neurological function. It created cognitive spacing, reflection, internal narrative continuity, imagination. Without silence and boredom, the mind lost recovery time. There are reports from former educators during this era describing students physically struggling to focus on a single task for extended periods, not because they were unintelligent, because their perceptual systems had adapted to rapid novelty cycling. Some archive psychologists compare it to living inside hundreds of partially completed conversations simultaneously. And maybe the strangest part is this. Most people knew something was happening. They felt it, the exhaustion, the fragmentation, the low-level anxiety after hours of scrolling, the inability to rest without stimulation nearby. But digital culture normalizes symptoms so completely that recognizing them changed nothing. One preserved discussion thread from 2025 contains millions of views. The topic was simple. Does anyone else feel mentally exhausted all the time? The responses stretched for thousands of pages. People describing identical emotional patterns. Attention fatigue, emotional numbness, memory instability, difficulty remaining present, constant low-grade anxiety. And beneath nearly every response, the same behavior continued uninterrupted. Scrolling. Future historians would later identify this as one of the defining contradictions of early digital civilization. Human beings became aware of the system shaping their psychology while remaining behaviorally unable to leave it. The archive implications become even darker when examining memory formation. Research increasingly indicates that constant attention switching significantly disrupted long-term emotional encoding. People remembered fragments, not continuity. Moments, not meaning. A meal photographed but not emotionally experienced. A conversation interrupted by alerts. A vacation remembered more clearly through uploaded images than through direct sensory memory. Some future anthropologists argued that humanity was slowly outsourcing the act of remembering itself, not intentionally, gradually, conveniently, until external systems began storing more emotional continuity than biological memory. And then something unexpected happened. The platforms became better at predicting human attention than humans themselves. Not through conspiracy, not through hidden control, through mathematics, behavioral optimization, pattern recognition. The systems learned exactly when people felt lonely, exactly when outrage increased engagement, exactly when uncertainty prolonged viewing duration. In many archive reconstructions, the feeds almost resemble adaptive emotional ecosystems, constantly learning, constantly adjusting, constantly refining the velocity of stimulation. One internal archive phrase appears repeatedly in later studies. Human attention became industrialized. By 2032, several psychological research institutions had already begun publishing concerns about continuous attention extraction models. The language was careful, measured, scientifically restrained. But beneath the academic wording, the implication was obvious. Human cognition was entering an environment it had never evolved to survive. Earlier civilizations fought for physical resources, territory, energy, food, labor. But the scroll era introduced something historically unprecedented, an economy competing directly for human perception itself. Every platform optimized for attention, every interface optimized for interruption, every algorithm optimized for behavioral prediction. And because the process happened gradually, most people adapted before they understood what adaptation meant. The archive contains reconstructed biometric data from average users during prolonged feed exposure, microspikes in anxiety, brief dopamine fluctuations, accelerated emotional cycling, reduced neurological settling periods. The nervous system remained partially activated for hours, sometimes entire days. One future researcher compared it to leaving hundreds of emotional tabs open inside the human brain simultaneously. Nothing fully resolved, nothing fully processed, everything partially active. The long-term consequences became increasingly visible in interpersonal behavior. Conversations shortened. Tolerance for conversational pauses decreased. Moments of silence became socially uncomfortable. People began reaching for devices during tiny gaps in interaction. Elevators, waiting rooms, crosswalks, restaurants, bedrooms. The archive repeatedly notes the same behavioral anomaly. Human beings were becoming less capable of existing without continuous external input. At first, many interpreted this as increased efficiency, a more connected civilization, a faster civilization. But future anthropologists eventually recognized a hidden cost. Human interiority had started collapsing. Reflection was slowly replaced by reaction. Observation replaced by stimulation. Presence replaced by velocity. There's a preserved interview recorded in 2041 with a former interface designer who helped build one of the largest behavioral recommendation systems of the early digital age. Near the end of the interview, he says something that later appeared in dozens of archive studies. "We thought we were helping people find what they wanted. We didn't realize we were also teaching them how to want." That sentence became historically significant because it captured one of the defining realizations of the era. The systems were not merely responding to human behavior anymore. They were shaping it, subtly, incrementally, continuously. The archive refers to this process as behavioral drift, not mind control, not manipulation in the cinematic sense. Something quieter. Millions of tiny adjustments to attention, expectation, emotional pacing, and cognitive habit, until entire populations gradually lost the ability to tolerate slower forms of existence. Some individuals noticed the transformation early. Writers, teachers, psychologists, parents. There are preserved records of people describing a strange emotional sensation after long periods online. Not exactly sadness, not exactly anxiety. Something emptier, a feeling that the mind had consumed too much while absorbing almost nothing. Future archives classified the sensation under a later framework: signal saturation, a condition where excessive informational exposure reduces emotional clarity instead of increasing understanding. Ironically, the more connected civilization became, the more psychologically isolated many individuals started feeling. Digital interaction created constant contact, but not always emotional presence. People watched each other continuously, tracked each other continuously, responded continuously, yet millions reported feeling increasingly unseen. The contradiction confused early researchers. How could the most connected civilization in human history simultaneously become one of the loneliest? The answer may have emerged decades later. Connection and exposure were never the same thing. The scroll era accidentally merged them together, and over time, human relationships themselves began adapting to platform logic. Shorter exchanges, faster emotional pacing, performative identity maintenance, compressed vulnerability. Even memory became partially externalized. Birthdays remembered by notifications, experiences validated through uploads, moments interrupted for documentation before emotional absorption finished occurring. One future anthropology report contains a line that many historians later described as quietly devastating. They recorded their lives constantly, perhaps because deep down they were already afraid of forgetting how those lives felt. But despite everything, despite the fragmentation, the exhaustion, the psychological acceleration, there was still something deeply human hidden inside the scroll era. People were searching for relief, for meaning, for connection. That part remained real. Some individuals slowly began escaping into quieter environments. Long-form conversations, books, silence, walks without devices, offline communities. At the time, these behaviors looked insignificant, but future behavioral historians now consider them early resistance patterns against cognitive acceleration, not political resistance. Psychological resistance, because eventually civilization realized something critical. Human beings cannot endlessly absorb stimulation without consequence. The nervous system keeps records, even when conscious awareness does not. By the mid-2040s, entire industries emerged around cognitive recovery, silence therapy, attention rehabilitation, sensory reduction environments. memory stabilization architecture. Children raised with controlled exposure windows instead of unrestricted feeds. Future cities even began designing public spaces specifically to reduce informational aggression, slower visual pacing, reduced advertisement density, quiet transit zones, reflection environments, places intentionally designed to protect uninterrupted thought, which means the archives ultimately reach a conclusion that still feels difficult to process. The crisis of the early digital age was never information itself. Human civilization had survived information before. Libraries did not break the nervous system. Knowledge did not fragment identity. Velocity did. The speed of emotional interruption became historically unprecedented, and for a brief period in human history, people mistook constant stimulation for normal consciousness. There is one final archive observation that appears near the end of several future anthropology reports. A question researchers repeatedly asked while studying behavioral footage from 2025, not with judgment, not with superiority, but with visible confusion. How did they live like this every day? Maybe the strangest part is that many people living through the scroll era were already asking themselves the same question while continuing to scroll. The anomaly remains unresolved.